All right, welcome. We are going to be in Revelation chapter 17 for this video. I'm going to actually start at the last verse, but then we're going to backtrack. So Revelation 17, verse 18, it says, "And the woman you saw is that great city which reigns over the kings of the earth." In the Greek, that's written in the present tense. So it's not she did reign or she will reign. It says it is the city that is reigning. It's present tense. So I think that's another little kind of side piece that I just wanted to throw in there, that there are several references in the book of Revelation to things that are currently happening, which I think lends much more weight to the idea that Revelation is about that first generation, the generation it was written to, right? That God was writing to the generation of believers that were going to see the great persecution where hundreds of thousands were killed. In fact, millions of Jews, and then tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of Christians. But millions and millions of Jews, in fact, were killed during this. I mean, maybe close to 10 million or so. There's almost 4 million just in the city of Jerusalem. That's not including all the other horrors that were going on. So anyways, lots of bloodshed. The temple was going to be destroyed. And so God is writing to those people. And something I was thinking about earlier today is that, say if you, now I believe Revelation is to that generation, and it's dealing with the fall of Jerusalem and the fall of the temple. But if it wasn't, just put that to the side, like say if it wasn't, that would mean that when Solomon's temple fell, there was, half the Old Testament almost, I'm exaggerating, but let's say 20% of the Old Testament was about the fall of Solomon's temple, and then there's another 10 or 15% of the Old Testament that is prophesying the future and how there's going to be all kinds of calamity in the future for Jerusalem because they are going to fail again. They're going to be a harlot again. Many of the Old Testament prophets call Israel a harlot. And Jesus, as he's finishing up his ministry, says that before this generation passes, all this terrible stuff's going to come on them, and we know it did. The temple was destroyed. If Revelation was not about the fall of Herod's temple, then that would mean that all this stuff that the Bible was talking about all the way through, about how the Jewish nation would eventually finally fall into such idolatry that God was just going to wipe them out and destroy them, and the temple was going to be destroyed, and all of that, everything that it was talking about all the way through. Moses talked about it in the Song of Moses. We talked about that in a previous video. Some of the Psalms talk about it. The prophets talk about it. Jesus talked about all this destruction. It would mean that the Bible just stopped and didn't even address the culmination of the whole thing. So much of the prophets were talking about how Israel was eventually not going to do right, and they were going to be eventually destroyed. And if Revelation is not about that, then that would mean the Bible just talked all about it, got right up to Jesus' time, was just a few years before it was going to happen, and the Bible just doesn't mention it. Doesn't talk anything about the fall of Herod's temple, doesn't show it at all, doesn't talk about it. It's just everything else was talking about it, gets right up to it, and then just doesn't mention it. Or the book of Revelation is not about the end of everything. It is the culminating piece of the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the old covenant and that entire way of life that went all the way from Abraham all the way to when the temple was destroyed. It was all wiped out. Now the people were scattered. They weren't like totally annihilated to where there's no more Jewish people. But for all intents and purposes, that version of Israel that had Jerusalem at the center and that old covenant and the sacrifices and everything, it lasted from Abraham all the way to right after Jesus, and I believe that Revelation is the culmination of that. It is the picture of the fall and destruction of the temple. All right. And then, Revelation 17:18 is using present tense to describe the city that's going to be destroyed. Right? Chapter 17 is about this great city that's destroyed. I'm going to make the case that it's Jerusalem. But he says that in his day, this is present tense Greek, in his day, that city is reigning. Right? That city is strong in his day. And so further proof. Another one is he talks in here, there's a section where he's talking about the kings that are reigning. He says 5 have been and 1 is, and 1 is still to come. So he's saying the 6th king is on the throne while he's writing, right? Which means that that these events are unfolding during his lifetime, So anyways, just further evidence piling up that the book of Revelation is not just some one-off that only has to do with the end of times and none of it has been fulfilled. It is the culmination of, in many ways, of what happened in the Old Covenant and the falling away of Israel and the birth of the new church. So you're going to see in chapter 17 that the main point is the fall of this city, right? But then in a previous section we talked about how the picture there was they're all coming to the edge of the water and they're singing the Song of Moses. Well, we talked about the Song of Moses was Moses in Deuteronomy writes this song that says when Israel will eventually become a harlot and God is going to ultimately destroy them. Because God's telling Moses at the end of his life that they're not going to be faithful. They're eventually going to turn away. And so Moses writes this song and God tells him to teach that song to them because it will be a witness against them at the end. And he said at the end, they will become a harlot and they will be destroyed. Well, so that was the previous section. So then now we're in chapter 17 and lo and behold, an angel says to John, here, come, let me take you. I want to show you, drum roll, the harlot, right? So that's the whole point of Moses' story was they're going to become a harlot. Then now the next scene is he says, hey, let me take you. I want to show you now the harlot. And in it, the harlot is described as a great city. And previously in chapter 11, he says the great city is Jerusalem. He says the great city is the city where the Lord was crucified. That's how he says it, which is clearly Jerusalem. So he says the great city is the city where the Lord was crucified. And then here in 17, he says the harlot is the great city. And so which is Jerusalem, right? And then the other interesting, this is just kind of a macro picture. We're going to look at some of the individual verses. But so it's the Song of Moses saying they're going to become a harlot and be destroyed. It's a scene where you have an actual harlot, which is a city that's being destroyed. And then you go into a scene later, not long after this, where the angel takes him and he says, in effect, cheer up, because now I'm going to show you the new Jerusalem. Right? So why do we need to see a new Jerusalem? Because the previous scene is about the fall of the old Jerusalem. It's about the fall of the harlot. It's about Jerusalem. And it's being destroyed. So the next scene is, hey, John, don't worry. There is a new Jerusalem that's going to take its place. And the whole point of why he's being shown a new Jerusalem is because what he was just shown is the fall of the old Jerusalem. And that's why you need a new one. So anyways, that's the kind of big picture of this chapter 16, 17, 18, all the way over into 19 and 20 and 21, you'll start to see the new Jerusalem. So we got 17, 18, 19, 20, about 5 of these videos left, and then we'll do a few more on a couple other things. We'll look at a few things in the prophets, but we're getting to the end of the book of Revelation. So let's go to 17 verse 1. So the idea here is we had been looking at the bowls of being poured out, and those are almost word for word the 7 trumpets. And the idea is, it appears to me that we had one entire scene of the 7 trumpets, and now he's showing essentially that same scene through the lens of the 7 bowls. And so it's two separate kind of visions that John gets that are covering much of the same thing, which is often how God works. Surely, surely. Whenever he says that, he says it twice. It's his way of saying this is important. That's what Joseph says when Pharaoh has the dream twice. He sees the vision two different times. Same idea, but slightly different. It's 7 cows in one and 7 stalks of wheat in the other. And he says, God showed you the same thing, but with 2 slightly different ways of showing it to you as a way of showing you that it is absolutely determined in God's heart that it's going to happen. And so I think that's what Revelation is. You see the 7 trumpets and then the 7 bowls are covering much of the same stuff. In fact, many of them are word for word. And so now the end of the 7 bowls arrives, and the angel says, all right, now I'm going to take you and I'm going to show you the harlot. And so now we're going to get a whole nother picture and scene here of the fall of Jerusalem, but it's from the picture of Jerusalem is this harlot, and she's riding on this beast, which is Rome, and the beast is going to destroy her, right? And that's exactly what happens. All right, 17:1. Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and talked with me, saying, come to me, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot, who sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth were made drunk with the wine of her fornication. Now, when it says she sits on many waters, in verse 15 of chapter 17, it says that's just a way of saying many peoples and nations and places. So why is Jerusalem being described as a city that sits on many waters all across the nations? Well, the reason is because there were 2 diasporas, one for the northern 10 tribes when Assyria came in and spread them everywhere. And then the second one for Judah when Babylon came in and sent them everywhere. And it's called the diaspora. It means they were spread out all over the place. On the day of Pentecost, the Bible says there were people from every country just about there. And so the Jews, because of previous destructions, had been spread all over the world. And so when Paul would travel, there was always a synagogue there. And so to say that Jerusalem then is the city that sits on many nations and many waters, it's not saying that its border is literally touching water or that its border is literally touching other nations. It's a way of saying that Jerusalem is this major city who has influence all over the world because the Jews are spread everywhere. And if you want, I want to just show you some places. Go with me to Isaiah real quick, chapter 1. And we're going to look at just some examples from the prophets of how God considered Israel in the leading up to the fall of Solomon's temple, called her a harlot. Right? And so that was biblical imagery for Jerusalem when the first temple was destroyed. And so, it's not, if you know your Bible and you realize, hey, when God got mad and destroyed the temple the first time, repeatedly, he said it's because they were a harlot. And so then now you come down to the end and Jerusalem's going to be destroyed again. It makes sense that he calls them the great harlot, right? All right, so verse 21. This is the opening of Isaiah. It sets the tone, and the whole theme of Isaiah is that Israel is not doing good, right? So Isaiah, this is chapter 1, the very opening vision that he gets, verse 21. He says, how the faithful city, that's Jerusalem, has become a harlot. It was full of justice, righteousness lodged in it, but now murderers. Your silver has become dross, your wine is mixed with water, your princes are rebellious, your companions are thieves. Everyone loves bribes and follows after rewards. They do not defend the fatherless, nor does the cause of the widow comes before them. Therefore says the Lord of hosts, the mighty one of Israel, I will rid myself of my adversaries and take vengeance on my enemies. I will turn my hand against you and thoroughly purge your dross, take away your alloy. I will restore your judges as at first and your counselors at the beginning. Afterward you shall be called the city of righteousness, the faithful city. And so it is a picture of the judgment coming on Jerusalem. And he's clear because they have become a harlot. And that's one of the major themes of the book of Isaiah. That's his opening vision, is that Israel has become a harlot. Turn with me over to Jeremiah chapter 3. Again, right at the beginning of Jeremiah, setting the tone for what the book is about, chapter 1, verse 3. Chapter 3, verse 1, rather. Says, they say, if a man divorces his wife and she goes from him and becomes another man, may he return to her again. Would not that land be greatly polluted? But you have played the harlot with many lovers, yet you return to me, says the Lord. And then he goes on to talk about how they're going to be destroyed. He said, in other words, he's saying if a woman left and she wanted to come back to her husband, it would be considered polluting the land. But yet Israel wants to go to idols and come back to the Lord, like some kind of great harlot. They can just go to this idol and go to that idol and come back to the Lord. And so the opening of Jeremiah, and he says, hey, you have become a harlot. And then I think I had one other one. I didn't write it down. I believe it's Hosea. Probably should have written it down, but I think it's Hosea chapter 9. And if it's not there, I'll just keep on going. Yeah, it is Hosea 9. Hosea chapter 9, verse 1. Do not rejoice, O Israel, with joy like other peoples, for you have played the harlot against your God. You have made love for hire on every threshing floor. The threshing floor and the winepress shall not feed them, and the new wine shall fail her. He says you played the harlot on the threshing floor. I may work that into a sermon one of these days, but I think the underlying reference is the temple itself was built on the threshing floor. The threshing floor was a spot where the community came, and Solomon's temple was built on. David looked out and saw the threshing floor and bought the threshing floor. So now he's talking about them playing the harlot on the threshing floor. And so it wasn't just the temple. Probably all kinds of threshing floors maybe were being used for idolatrous purposes, but there is an underlying idea there that the temple itself was put on a threshing floor. All right, so anyways, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Hosea, Ezekiel. I didn't even put Ezekiel's in there. I think that might be chapter 16. It's almost pornographic, so I didn't include it. You can read that on your own when the kids are asleep. But about how Israel has become the harlot, right? And he doesn't hold back at all in Ezekiel. And so that's three of the biggest prophets in the whole thing: Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. And all three of those were leading up to the fall of Jerusalem's temple. Ezekiel and Jeremiah were alive during the fall, and Isaiah was clearly made that a big part of his ministry, was what was going to happen to them. But Ezekiel and Jeremiah were living through the fall of Solomon's temple. And so God is saying, hey, this is coming. You've become the harlot. So all of that is just to lay the foundation that to call Jerusalem the harlot is not something out of left field. It is one of the clearest images that God used, the most consistent probably image that he used to describe how he viewed them because of their idolatry and because of their evil, right, whenever they would fall away. So anyways, that just goes to show the Old Testament kind of comparison. And then one other one, if you want to look at some point in Jeremiah 51, when he talks about the city sitting on the waters and the cup in their hand. Jeremiah 51, that is a quote. I do believe it still has to do with the diaspora, but here's another angle to that. Jeremiah 51 is almost a quote of Revelation 17, 1 and 2. And it's describing Babylon, right? And you'll see in the previous chapters we talked about Jerusalem's already been called Sodom. They've already been called Egypt. Now they're being called Babylon. And the idea is that those are wicked, evil cities that were going to fall. And he wants Jerusalem to see that they have become just like the enemy cities that are going to be destroyed. And so he's using metaphors from evil cities that were to be destroyed to describe Jerusalem right before their fall. And so that whole thing about sitting on the many waters and the nations being drunk with their idolatries, that's what Jeremiah prophesied about Babylon before that city was destroyed. And so the idea is he's saying, Jerusalem, you have become like all these evil cities. And that's why if you look at verse 5, it says, this is the mystery of Babylon the Great. The reason he calls it a mystery is because it's not literally about Babylon, right? If it was about Babylon the city, it's not a mystery. Whenever they say a mystery, they're saying this is a clue to what we're talking about, but it's not the actual thing. So when he says the mystery of Babylon the Great in verse 5, it's because this is not about the city of Babylon, which during their time had already been wiped out and destroyed as ruins by then. He's saying it's a mystery because this is really about Jerusalem. But God is going to describe Jerusalem in the same imagery that he described Babylon before they fell. All right, so let's go read a little more. Verse 3. He says, so he carried me away in the spirit to the wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, which was full of blasphemous names, having 7 heads and 10 horns. This is the same description of the beast from earlier that we said is a picture of Rome. From the time of Julius Caesar until the time of the destruction of Jerusalem, there were 7 Caesars. So 7 heads, 10 horns. Rome was divided up into 10 districts, right? So he has 7 heads, 10 horns. It's the picture of Rome. But I think it's interesting. He finds the woman in the wilderness, which, if you remember from Old Testament, wilderness is a big key word. It's easy to read right over it. But he says, he took me and I saw the woman was in the wilderness, right? Wilderness is where Israel was condemned to because they were not faithful to God under Moses. So he says, hey, I see this great city. I see this harlot. And you know where he took me, where I found her? She was in the wilderness. She's not in the promised land. And that's not a geographical thing. That's a picture of unfaithful means you're in the wilderness. Not being obedient to God means you're in the wilderness. It was their obedience that caused them to be able to go into the promised land. All right. It says, the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet, adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the filthiness of her fornication. Right? Again, this is that same description of the actual city of Babylon before it was destroyed. And so he opens chapter 17 saying, I see this harlot, and he uses the imagery of Babylon before it was destroyed. And then the other part that I would throw in is the specific colors he's using are the colors of the high priest and the temple, the purple and scarlet, and those were the colors of the temple curtain in the front. The building itself was probably white. Solomon's had a lot of red. I think Herod's was primarily white with this purple, that big veil, that was on the front of the temple was purple and scarlet. Because that matched the high priest's outfit. And so the whole picture from the Old Testament was the high priest matches the temple. And that's why Jesus says, if you destroy this temple, I'll raise it up in 3 days. This he spoke of his body, right? So the whole point is he was trying to get them to see that the temple is really a person, right? It's really our high priest, which is Jesus. And now that we are the body of Christ, we are also, Paul says now, the temple of the Holy Spirit. All right. And so we have this picture of Babylon, but there's also kind of this overtone that this woman is wearing the high priest's outfit because it's a picture of an idolatrous priesthood, an idolatrous Israel. It says on her forehead was written blasphemous names, right? On her forehead a name was written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and the abominations of the earth. On the Day of Atonement, the high priest wore a golden plate with a phrase said, Holy unto the Lord. And he had a cup in his hand. So now we have this harlot who's wearing the high priest's clothes with a cup in her hand and a plate on his forehead, but instead of it saying Holy to the Lord, it says mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of harlots, abominations of the earth, right? But it is a picture of an idolatrous priesthood, an idolatrous Israel. Right? And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints, with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And when I saw her, I marveled with a great marvel. And so I think kind of interesting, Jesus says that Jerusalem, back in 24, 23 through 25 in Matthew, when Jesus is giving all this description of what's going to happen in Jerusalem, he says the blood of all the saints will be judged on that generation. And so when John sees this harlot, he says she's drunk with the blood of the martyrs, right? Which is exactly the main sin that Jesus says she was being judged for. Now, obviously, she's not faithful to God, and there's all kinds of sin there, but Jesus specifically pointed out how many godly people, saints, prophets, that Jerusalem had killed, and he says they will be judged for all of those. And so the picture of the harlot is not just that she's unfaithful, but she's drunk. And what is she drunk on? The blood of all the godly people she killed. Right? So it all really fits together. The angel said to me, "Why do you marvel? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and the beast that carries her, which has 7 heads and 10 horns. The beast that you saw was and is not, and will ascend out of the bottomless pit and go to perdition. And those who dwell on the earth will marvel, whose names are not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they see the beast that was and is not and yet is." And then he goes on to explain what he's talking about here. And I think this will help. He says, verse 9, "Here is the mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. There are also 7 kings." So that's the 7 Caesars. But he also says she sits on 7 mountains, which is how they describe the city of Rome. Right? So this is all not talking about the harlot. This is talking about the beast that's going to kill the harlot. The beast is on 7 mountains, which is what they called Rome. She has 7 kings, which is the 7 Caesars from Julius to when the temple falls under Vespasian, who is the 7th. And then the beast that was and is not is himself also the 8th, and is of the 7, and is going to perdition. What I think he's talking about is the beast is not just Rome and these 7 Caesars. There is another leader behind the scenes, and it is the great dragon himself, Satan. I think when he's saying there is an 8th king here who belongs to all of these, and he is going to perdition, and he has come up out of the pit. So I think he's saying there are 7 human kings, but it's not just about them. Satan is behind this entire thing that's going on with Rome. And we see that in previous chapters, that the great dragon is Satan, but he's giving the beast his power. That's the previous chapter. He says the beast receives its power from the dragon. So when he says, I see this beast that has 7 kings, but really there's an 8th too, that belongs to each of them. Now he was influenced all of them. Right? So I think, and so when it says he comes out of the pit, I don't think he's talking about the 7. I think he's talking about this is Satan's working, right? Now, and then when he says who was, is not, and will be again, there's either 2 ways to take that. Either it's talking about Satan, who was an influence, sitting down to the pit, and is going to have influence again, or it's talking about the Roman Empire itself, because at the time, right around when this is written, you've got Caesars in control, but then during the 6th one, when this was written, Nero kills himself, and the whole empire is in chaos, and they don't have a Caesar. But then the 7th Caesar then rises after that, and he's the one that destroys Jerusalem. So it's kind of like you had Rome was under the leadership of a Caesar. They're currently not, or about to be not. And then Caesar will sit back on the throne again. So it's either talking about the headship of the Caesars, how they were started, went into chaos, had no Caesar for a while, and then he comes back. Or it's a picture of Satan himself who was influencing the earth, gone down to the pit, and is coming back to fight again. But either way, the idea is the beast is Rome, Satan is behind it, and they are going to destroy the harlot, which is Jerusalem. All right. And then verse 12, it says, the 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings who have received no kingdom as of yet, but they receive authority for 1 hour as kings with the beast. So I believe these are the 10 districts. They each had their leaders, but they didn't have their own independent kingdom. They were still part of Rome. Right? So they were kind of sub-kings, if you will, of their district, but they didn't have their own kingdom. They were all still part of Rome. And they get their authority from Rome. Verse 13, these are of one mind, and they will give their power and authority to the beast. These will make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them, for he is the Lord of lords and King of kings, and those who are with him are called, chosen, and faithful. Now, let me just give you something real quick. It's interesting because this whole section of 17 is about the beast going to war with the harlot. But then here in verse 12 and 13, verse 14, he says, but they are also making war with the Lamb. And I think the way to understand that is when Rome is coming through, not only are they wanting to destroy Jerusalem, but they're also persecuting Christians at the same time. Both of these are happening at the same time. At the same time that they have set their sights on destroying Jerusalem and wiping out the Jewish nation, they are also going through the empire looking for Christians and killing Christians wherever they find them. So it's kind of like a war on two fronts. They're after the harlot of Jerusalem and the Jewish people, but they're also making war against the Lamb and God's people. And so the picture is the beast will destroy the harlot, but he will not defeat the Lamb, which is the body of Christ and God's people. Right? And so even though he's making war against both, he only has victory against the harlot. He does not have ultimate victory against the Lamb and his people. Right? And so, just to give you a little history backdrop on how the war kind of went, not only was the Roman Empire attacking Jerusalem and the Promised Land itself, there's Jews everywhere. So it's the city that sits on many waters, and so all over the place. So Caesarea, I told you that was kind of like the Rome of Israel. When the war started, that was one of the first things. They killed every Jew in their city there, and so really just got rid of all of them. And so there was lots of bloodshed there. Syria got in on it and tried to exterminate all the Jews that lived in Syria. Scythopolis, Ascalon over there in capital of the Philistine regions, that whole area, they killed all the Jews that were living over there. Tyre had slaughters there. I think perhaps the biggest one, Alexandria, during when Nebuchadnezzar comes in and destroys Solomon's temple, the single greatest place that they fled to was Alexandria. Now, Nebuchadnezzar took maybe 35,000 people with him to Babylon. That's where Daniel comes in, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He takes about 25 or 30,000 as educated prisoners. So these weren't just slaves, like no count, no good kind of just manual laborers. He took the best and the brightest of the entire city back to his city with him. That's how Nebuchadnezzar did it. But because the temple had fallen and there was no leadership, most of the Jews now felt unsafe to stay in the Promised Land. And so there was a mass exodus over to Alexandria, because that was like a college kind of community, a learning community. It was safer. It was a place where you could go and read and be scholars. And it just was very appealing to the Jewish people who were people of the book, well educated. They all went to Alexandria. And so other than Jerusalem, Alexandria was the single greatest Jewish population in the world. And so when Rome starts defeating them, Alexandria stepped up and said, hey, we'll help. And in I think a single day, they slaughtered 50,000 Jews in Alexandria and just left their bodies in the streets, blood everywhere. It was just the whole world in that part of the world was against the Jews. And so it was not just the fall of Jerusalem, it was slaughter everywhere. And so when he's saying that those 10 districts will join the beast and set in their mind to start killing the harlot. That's what they're talking about. In verse 15 he says, "And he said to me, the waters which you saw where the harlot sits are peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues. And the 10 horns which you saw on the beast, these will hate the harlot, and make her desolate and naked, eat her flesh, and burn her with fire." Right? And so they often sent troops to help support the Roman invasion of Jerusalem. And so there was a whole, the whole world kind of, the Roman world, turning on Israel when the war starts, right? And just another side history piece. Titus, who was the general that destroyed the temple under Vespasian, the record says that his generals underneath him were divided on whether they should leave Herod's temple rather in place or not. Some people said it's one of the greatest buildings in the whole world. If you leave it standing and wipe out all the people, it shows the austerity and the reserve and the strength of Rome, that we conquered you, but we left this greatness standing. And then other people said, no, we want people to fear Rome. Let's utterly destroy the temple. And Titus sided with the people who wanted to destroy it, but for a slightly different reason. Because he was after Jews and Christians. And he said they both trace their origins. Inside, he didn't know theology very well, but he said they both trace their origins back to Jerusalem and back to this temple. So if I destroy the temple, it may help to eradicate both of those religions at the same time. And so that was how he made his final judgment. So that just kind of fits with the idea that the beast is, on the one hand, making war against the harlot, and on the other hand, he's making war against the lamb, right? All right, and then we can look at verse 18. 17 says, "He put into their hearts to fulfill his purpose, to be of one mind, to give their kingdom to the beast, until the words of God are fulfilled." Right? So that means until Jerusalem's destroyed, they were all in unity. Particularly many of the Arab nations too. They didn't like the Jews, just like they don't like them now. They didn't like them either, and so they sent lots of soldiers to be with Rome and say, "Hey, we will, we'll help." And so all these districts really came together to destroy. And then verse 18 it says, "The woman you saw is the great city which reigns over the kings." Now it says kings of the earth, which could also, as we know, mean kings of the land, as in the promised land. So it's either one or two things. I prefer to think that it's talking about kings of the land. So the promised land was divided up into like 4 different districts. Each one had a king, but Jerusalem was the capital city that really had the authority over the whole thing. Even though from a technical standpoint, Philip had authority over his region, and Archelaus and Herod Antipas and different ones had their own regions, but ultimately Jerusalem was the centerpiece for the Jewish people, right, for the land of Israel. So I think it's most likely just should be translated land. Now this is one thing that causes some people not to think that this could have been talking about Jerusalem, because it's so clearly about Jerusalem till you come down here and it says they reign over the kings of the earth. And you say, well, how does Jerusalem reign over the kings of the earth? So I think it probably should be translated kings of the land, right, as in promised land. Or the other way to take this is through the covenant that they were supposed to have. Jerusalem was supposed to be the throne of God. It was supposed to be the city that had authority over all the kings. They're not using it. They're going to be stripped of it. But if they had been operating in authority that God gave them, if they had been operating under the covenant that God gave them, they were the city that has authority over every king on the earth. But when they fall into sin, then they lose it. So both of those are options, because from just a purely covenant standpoint, theological standpoint, Jerusalem was the city that was supposed to have authority over every other king on the earth. But they lost it through sin, evil, and not fulfilling the covenant and everything like that. All right, so that's 17. We'll pause there. 18 kind of continues on with the story. It kind of gives a little more detailed look at some of the events that happened in the fall of Babylon. But when it's talking about Babylon the Great, and we'll talk about this next week, it is not talking about the actual city of Babylon. We'll come back to 17, what we did today. He says the woman is the mystery of Babylon. The great city is this mystery of Babylon because it's not actually about Babylon. It's about Jerusalem. But Babylon was the great enemy of Jerusalem. Babylon is the one that destroyed Jerusalem. And so Babylon is Jerusalem's greatest enemy. And they talked about Babylon all the time, about how they were the enemy nation and the evil nation and all that kind of stuff, because they're the ones that destroyed Solomon's temple, and they're the ones that did it. And so now, when they're about to be destroyed, they are now referred to as Babylon the Great, right? And so that's why it's going to say that in these next chapter or two. All right, well, let's take a pause there.